Hello world, my name's John Corbett. I'm the president of the Bras Tisol Intercultural Language Education SIG. And on behalf of Bras Tisol and the SIG, I'd like to say how pleased we are to be involved in this pop-up online symposium on inclusion in ELT global perspectives. Although I'm the president of the Bras Tisol SIG, I'm actually working now in China. And I'm at Beijing Normal University, Hong Kong Baptist University's United International College in Zhuhai in China. So I'm living in Brazil and, like many of us, teaching online, in this case teaching online in China. And so it seems appropriate that today I'm going to be talking to you on the subject of telecollaboration and in particular negotiating diverse identities in telecollaboration. I'm going to assume that many of the people watching will have little knowledge or experience of telecollaboration, so please bear with me if you have had quite a lot of experience while I go through some of the basics. I'm going to very quickly define what telecollaboration is. I'm going to talk about how one goes about finding partners for telecollaboration. It is collaboration, so you do need partners. How do you find each other? I'll talk about how my partners found each other. We were planning originally to do this as a panel session, but the logistics of doing that grew that rather scary, so it's just me talking about them. I will mention them, or many of them, towards the end, but I will talk about how you find partners and perhaps more importantly, how partners need to align their aims at the outset of a telecollaboration if it's going to work, and how you have to get the participants also to understand the framework of the telecollaboration before it starts. We are the Intercultural Language Education SIG, so we're interested in developing intercultural communicative competence. There are many definitions of intercultural communicative competence, but one of the simplest, I guess, is those qualities and skills and types of knowledge that you need to benefit from the enriching encounter with otherness. And this is where diversity comes in. People who are taking part in telecollaborations will meet people from diverse backgrounds. People from diverse backgrounds will need to be included in the immediate learning community of the telecollaboration, and that's not always easy. Many people who have been working with telecollaborations know how difficult that is. So we'll be talking about how participants come together in an inclusive learning community, cope with otherness, negotiate otherness, reflect upon their own identities as a consequence of encountering otherness, and therefore work with developing, creating, maintaining, sustaining their identities. Conversations in telecollaboration communities can be fairly superficial, and one of the jobs of the teacher is to deepen them. But a lot of the learning in telecollaborations doesn't go on in the conversations, it goes on in the reflections after the conversations have happened. So I'll be talking about that, how negotiations are how identities are negotiated online, how conversations about those identities and calling upon those identities might be deepened, and then how we reflect upon the whole process afterwards. So that's pretty much going to be the structure of the session. So first of all, what is telecollaboration? Excuse me if you can hear the parrots going by in the distance. What is telecollaboration? Telecollaboration is what happens when you bring together geographically separated groups of learners in an online learning community. In the past, I've been involved in telecollaborations with learners here in Brazil, but in different parts of Brazil, Rio, Sao Paulo, Curitiba, Natal, with learners in Argentina, Scotland, Cyprus, Taiwan, Macau, Poland, and other places. So you bring together these geographically dispersed learners, and together they share an online community. In the past, we've used different platforms for this online community. We've used Moodle, we've used Facebook, we've used Edmodo, and we're currently using Google Classrooms. So there are different platforms that can be used for this kind of activity. First of all, you need to find partners to telecollaborate. There are various institutions like the British Council and the United States Embassy regional English language offices who will help to find partners, or who say they will help to find partners. But in my experience, and in the experience of those that I've worked with, the best way to find partners is to go to conferences, go to seminars, identify simpatico, like-minded people and talk to them about the possibility of doing this. They don't need to be in other countries. They can be in the same country but in other places. But if you're at an international conference, or if you have the opportunity to take part in an international seminar, you can talk to the people there and say, I would like to take part in something like this. I would like to establish something like this. Will you help me do it? So conferences are good. Professional development courses are good. Friends and friend networks are probably the best way to find partners. It can be slow, but you can start small and slowly build up a bigger and bigger network of people who are involved in this kind of activity. One of the things that you've got to do at the outset is you have to align the aims of your partners. No matter how friendly you are with your partner will have certain expectations, probably unarticulated, about what the telecollaboration is for. And certainly once you start working with the learners themselves, they will have sometimes quite different expectations about what the exchange is for. So you have to talk a lot at the outset. First amongst the partners, the facilitators or coordinators, what is this exchange for? Is it fun or is it serious? It doesn't really matter which one it is. As long as you share those aims, it can be a fun exchange, it can be more serious. You can explore particular topics through the telecollaboration, or you can simply say, let's put these people together, give them something to do and see what happens. So is it fun? Is it serious? What are your expectations of it? What do you want to get out of it by the end of it? Do you want basically language improvement, or do you want to explore particular topics? For participants particularly, they will need to know how often they're expected to interact, how quickly they are expected to respond to other people posting in the community. And you need a set of topics to write about or to talk about. So you need to identify the topics and who is going to be in charge of the topics and what the topics are going to be about. If you're interested in diversity and inclusion, you can identify a set of topics to talk about. But otherwise, you might simply say, well, let's explore aspects of our lives. And this is what I have tended to do. Let's explore aspects of our lives, and then aspects of identity, diversity, inclusion kind of naturally come up, or they don't. But if they come up, they will come up naturally as part of an interaction, often about something else. The aims that the partners on the exchanges that I've been involved in tend to have the common goal or the common purpose of developing participants' intercultural communicative competence. As I say, there are many models of this. I know we'll be talking about the CEFR later today. The CEFR has some quite useful models of intercultural communicative competence. They have been critiqued, but most people, I think, would agree that intercultural communicative competence, if it exists, involves things like openness to otherness, the ability and the desire to engage with otherness rather than to run away from it, to reflect on oneself as part of the process of engaging with otherness. It's an intercultural communicative event, so you reflect on yourself as well as engaging with otherness. This means that you need a certain amount of curiosity. You need to establish a certain amount of respect for otherness. You need to mediate, or you need to have the ability to mediate when you find aspects of otherness that make you less comfortable, for example, or if there's a conflict that arises out of the engagement with otherness. And you need a certain amount of resilience as a coordinator as well as a participant when conflict arises and things look as if they might go wrong. So these are the kind of things that you want to build up through the exchange. Openness, a curiosity that prompts us to engage with otherness and not to fear it or to run away from it. Curiosity, respect, an ability to mediate, the language that is required for mediation, and the ability to be resilient when it doesn't work. And very, very often, as we know from life, things don't work. So you have your overall aims. How do you achieve these aims? Well, usually in the telecollaborations that I've been involved with, we develop amongst the partners, amongst the coordinators, a group of tasks that are designed to frame or to develop intercultural communicative competence. And these are all designed to encourage engagement within the group, among the participants, with otherness, and they're designed to prompt reflection on the self. So the kind of tasks that you hope will do this are ethnographic tasks, descriptive tasks, where you might explore and describe the home community and present that to the others and invite responses. So you begin with yourself, put yourself on the line, and then invite responses and deal with those responses. You might also have a more creative task. These are actually very, very good ways of expressing and reflecting upon oneself. You might encourage people to do poems, short stories, drama with photographs. Some people that I know have been using flash fiction and flash non-fiction to explore the self and otherness. So you take part in some kind of creative task, put that online, and again invite responses. Very often for the ethnographic tasks and the creative tasks, it's the responses that for the facilitators are much more interesting than the presentations themselves. It's how people then interact as they engage with their selves and the otherness. And there might be reflective tasks, topics for discussions. The facilitators might bring some of these to the table. In my experience, once groups begin to come together and develop a sense of trust and a degree of comfort with the learning community and the format, and that takes time. But if they do that, then the best discussion topics tend to come from the learners themselves. They begin to explore ideas and issues around diversity and inclusion and cultural behaviours that interest them. And these are the most genuine, the most sincere, and very, very often the most interesting topics for discussion. But these are the kind of the three main elements. So you can structure a telecollaborative course around a range of these task types. I want to go into a little bit more detail about these task types and the kind of responses that they might prompt. For all the responses that I'm going to show you, we have permissions from, well, I'll keep them anonymous, but we have permissions from the users to make these public. We always did have permission from all the participants in our telecollaborative tasks to use these as data, anonymized duly, and in presentations such as this one. So our gratitude is due also to the participants who allowed their posts to be used. The kind of ethnographic task that is common for telecollaborative exchange is to visit a public or domestic space, describe the people, the environment, share that, and invite responses. The participants respond with questions and comments, and as I say, for the facilitator, it's the responses that are often much more interesting than the presentations themselves. One of the earliest telecollaborations that I took part in, around about 2004, I think it was, it's about 16 years ago now, one of the participants in Brazil went into the local park in Curitiba in southern Brazil and interviewed street artists and then shared the findings with groups in Scotland and in Taiwan at the time, and people interacted about these people who were performing on the street or in parks in the locality. And this is part of the ethnographic study. The participant just saying, hello, these are some of the artists who were interviewed during our study. So you've got photographs of the statue man, a balloon sculptor, and a musician, a flute player. So they were interviewed, the interviews were presented, and then people asked questions, and they compared activities like this in their home locality. Another possible and sometimes undervalued task type that can be very, very rich and very suggestive is to get people to respond creatively to a place or a situation that they've got experience of and put that forward for discussion and reflection. These will be creative tasks. So you might visit a local place that's important to you. You might write a poem about it, take a photo of it, post it to the Telecollaboration site or the Telecollaboration page, and then, very, very important, respond to others. So you're not just presenting, you're responding. And again, it is the responses that are important. Some entire telecollaborations can be built around the exchange of creative pieces. Recently, I've been tangentially involved in watching a telecollaboration between students at the Islamic University of Gaza in Palestine who are writing fiction and then posting that for comment and engagement to students in the northeast of Brazil, in Natal, who have been writing flash non-fiction for the Palestinians. So these two groups have been coming together around creative tasks. And that can be a very, very rich way of prompting people to engage with otherness and to reflect upon themselves. This is an example of a Facebook telecollaboration between students in Macau, where I used to work, and students in Malmo. This was a telecollaboration run by a professor of creative writing, in fact, in Macau, but I was fortunate enough to observe it. And students in Malmo in Sweden and Macau in China were asked to visit a local place, write poems about it, and then respond. And so this is one student, Melva, who has written about one of the many casinos in Macau, casino capital of the world, and talks about the local feelings about casinos, the mixed feelings that many of the locals have about casinos. And then that becomes the topic of discussion for people globally. And there are responses and counter-responses to the poem. The thing about the poem is that it seems to prompt a much richer emotional response to certain locations, feelings, and situations. So creative responses are very, very good ways of engaging with otherness and reflecting upon the self. And finally, again, once students feel comfortable doing so in the learning community, they might open up a discussion and invite a response. And this was one that was prompted by a Scottish student taking part of one of my earlier telecollaborations, a student in Glasgow who entitled her post, "If Not With Poppies." It was round about the 11th of November of that particular year, and she was interested in how members of the community across the world, how members of different communities commemorate those who lost their lives in conflict. And I want to just take a quick look at how she posted that response, how she posted that prompt and how it was responded to. Some of the telecollaborations that I've been involved in have had native speakers as well as non-native speakers of English as part of them. And so this has been useful because the native speakers sometimes unconsciously provide good models of discussion openers. And this is a very, very good way of, linguistically, it's a very, very good way of opening a discussion. So Fiona G says, "As I was putting my poppy in my jacket the other day, I wondered how people in other countries remembered those in the armed forces who have died fighting for their country. Is the poppy a recognised symbol everywhere? I'd be really interested to know how other countries remember, and if not with poppies, then is there another recognised symbol? Does anyone else take part in the 2-minute silence on Remembrance Sunday? Serious stuff, I know, but I'm really interested, Fiona G." Now this is interesting for the development of intercultural communicative competence. The activity of being in the learning community has prompted this participant to look at something that is happening in her own culture, the celebration of Remembrance Sunday around the 11th of November, and she's beginning to ask herself, is this culture specific? Is this something that only we do? Does this happen elsewhere? And she's using the intercultural telecollaboration to find out. And interestingly, she gets a response from a German. And the German begins, "In Germany we don't have Remembrance Sunday, strange but true. However, the 9th of November is used as a multi-remembrance day commemorating the following historical events." And so there's an explanation of acts of remembrance in Germany. Now this is partly interesting because it's a telecollaboration between two members of communities who were historically part of a conflict and who remember them in different ways. And so for both sides, this increases intercultural communicative competence. This increases their knowledge and their engagement with otherness. Now, that level of sophistication and openness in posts doesn't come immediately, even for native speakers. And so the members of the learning community have to have a period of time, usually, unless you're very lucky. They usually have a period of time to build up a degree of rapport and trust. You've got to remember that at the outset of any telecollaboration, you're throwing the participants together. They don't know each other. They don't know anything about their co-participants' background, beliefs, attitudes. They're like the hooded figures in Magritte's portrait on the slide. So you're throwing these complete strangers together and you're asking them to open up their identities to others. So it takes time to establish rapport and trust. So one of the things that you do as a facilitator is that you construct tasks that encourages learners to engage with each other and build up rapport and trust. And so you help them to develop and to maintain and to negotiate their online identities. And it's to the nature of these identities and the way that learners negotiate them that we now turn. Now, it's been argued that participants bring three broad types of identity to telecollaborations, and they develop and negotiate these identities as part of the experience of telecollaboration. One is a situated identity. It's the roles that participants assume by virtue of being members of the online community. So this actually gives them an identity. It is an inclusive identity. You include them in the community and you ask them to do certain things. So they have roles as part of the online community. So you have to have an understanding of those roles. The second kind of identity that people bring to telecollaborations is based on the communication that they practice as part of the online community. So these are discursive identities. You will get people in the learning community who start conversations all the time. Your conversation starters, your habitual talkers. It's like real life. These will be the initiators. Then you'll get another group of people who are happy responding. They will wait for other people to begin and then they will respond. And then you might get a third type of person, the lurker, who's very happy to engage indirectly with otherness simply by watching interactions going on. It doesn't mean that they're not developing intercultural communicative competence, but they're not initiating or responding to discussions directly. So you might want to think what you're going to do about that. Are you going to accept that, or are you going to try to nudge them into different discourse roles? The main content of a telecollaboration is usually built around what are called transportable identities. And these are the aspects of participants' prior experience that they bring to and negotiate and present as part of the telecollaboration. And these will be things like their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their sexual orientation, their class, their nationality. But it will also be things like, are they lovers of pets? What kind of food do they eat? What are their favourite television programmes? What's their favourite music? So these will be the things that people will bring to the telecollaboration, and they may or may not include that in the discussions. It may become or may not become part of the content of the discussions. So let's take a look again at these three types of identity in a little bit more detail. Teachers and participants have to think about the situated and discursive identities a little bit before the telecollaboration starts. They've got to have an understanding, they've got to have a clear understanding again of what the online community is for and what roles they expect the participants to play in these online communities. Do they expect the learners to take them seriously? Do they expect a high degree of engagement shown through initiating discussions, posting, responding? Or are you content with people simply to watch? How will you engage your learners to engage with otherness? So the teacher needs to align their roles, make the roles explicit, make the expectations explicit, prompt the learners, perhaps nudge the lurkers into initiating or responding to expand their discursive identities. But you've got to make sure that you understand what the situated identities and discursive identities are likely to be for the community as you set it up. Otherwise, people will have different expectations and there will be miscommunication. There will be exclusion of some people from the community. For general intercultural exchanges such as the ones that I've been involved in, it's the transportable identities that make up much of the content. And what happens is that learners, participants, tend to chat. They tend to find topics and follow those topics. And it's the topics that build the relationships, the rapport and the trust that may allow for deeper conversations eventually. But chat also allows issues of diversity, issues of inclusion to arise spontaneously if that's what the learners feel comfortable doing. Now, the transportable identities that people can bring are things to do with race, class, gender, sexuality. But people don't tend to talk about those, certainly at the outset. At the outset, people tend to talk about what are their pets? Do they like the beach? What kind of food do they enjoy eating? What kind of drinks do they enjoy? What are their leisure pursuits? And there's a lot of lists. Bucket lists, best of lists. What kind of wallpaper would you use to decorate this kind of apartment type of lists? Now, these may seem trivial topics. And I've got to admit, when I started doing telecollaborations, I began to feel exasperated that the learners were not talking about the serious things that I wanted them to talk about. But one of the things that I began to realize was that these chat topics, these transportable identities, built up rapport, built up trust, and sometimes they branched out into the deeper topics of diversity and inclusion and engagement with otherness that I hoped as part of the development of intercultural communicative competence. So you're going to see quite a lot of this kind of thing about transportable identities. This is, again, an early interaction. This might seem like a bit of an odd question, but I was just wondering what everybody's favourite drink is, not including alcohol. Mine would have to be that old British favourite tea, although I know many others prefer coffee. Bit of a dull subject, I know, but I thought it might be interesting to see how much we all differ in our basic preferences. I would much appreciate everyone's thoughts and ideas. So it's a very safe topic. But at the core of it, there is an interesting idea. It might be interesting to see how much we all differ in our basic preferences. So it's a safe way to initially engage with difference. And this is one response to it. Hi Elsa, my favourite drink is mineral water, maybe tea. I come from Hungary, where people do not drink much tea, and if I really want to upset them, I pour some milk in my black tea. They think it's disgusting. So there you've got an opener and a response. And in a very safe way, talking about non-alcoholic drinks, people are beginning to engage with otherness. So these are like baby steps. This is like building up rapport, building up trust, talking about safe topics, beginning to talk about diversity, using safe topics, and doing it in a very, very supportive way. So you might, as a facilitator with your collaborator, build up a telecollaboration, set up a telecollaboration to deal with things like conflict and exclusion in Palestine and Natal. You bring the people together, and what do they talk about? They talk about the beach and going to the beach. So my advice is don't be disappointed if that is the point of departure for the conversations, because chat, that kind of chat, those transportable identities, can begin to lead to other issues and other types of transportable identity. They can lead to issues of race and politics and sexual orientation. And one of the things that people do begin to talk about quite a lot, in my experience, is naming conventions. We will be talking in a panel session about naming conventions as part of this pop-up symposium. Naming conventions are also an important part of online telecollaborations. And I'll give you one of my favorite examples of this. Again, in an earlier telecollaboration that I had, one chat which began about cross-cultural perspectives on beauty, which was prompted by a Taiwanese participant who wanted to talk about plastic surgery and eyelids. It began an intercultural conversation about beauty and different international standards of beauty, and that kind of led quite naturally and spontaneously to a discussion of sexual orientation and preferences, and this was prompted by a gay participant, a gay European participant, who began to open up on his sexuality and begin to talk about it. And then people began to respond to this, and they responded in interesting ways. So this is the prompt again. You remember this is part of a chat which began as a chat about beauty. And then one participant, an initiator, said, consider a person's sexuality is defined through the type of sex this person has. If they have sex with a person of the same sex, they are homosexual. And if they have sex with a person of the opposite sex, they are heterosexual. And most people would find it rather easy to classify themselves into either group. What if I added another group? Solosexuality. People who have sex with themselves are solosexual. This may seem absurd, but only because it goes against the categories that society forces upon us. One may say that most solosexuals will also have sex with other people, but I say they only do so because society allows them to do so. If society made people categorize themselves as either solosexual or homo-heterosexual, then people would, at least apparently, and let's not get into what people do when nobody's looking, restrict themselves to either sexuality. What do you think? So now we're a long way from what's your favourite drink, not including alcohol. Now this for me was the most interesting response to this, and this came from an ethnic minority student who was also an evangelical Christian. And she's part of the learning community. The gay participant is also part of the learning community, and they're having a conversation about solosexuality, a concept that has just been made up by the community. And she says, I've never really heard of solosexuality, but it's an interesting concept, and I see the point you're making with it. I hope I don't offend anyone. I'm really just asking out of ignorance. But didn't they call homosexuality sodomy in the Middle Ages? I think the word was from the story of Lot, who lived in Sodom, being approached by men asking to have sexual intercourse with his male guests in the Bible. Also, why do you think society has chosen to categorize sexuality in this way? Do you think it's been influenced by religion, or a specific religion, for example, Christianity? What do you think about that? And do you think that it's becoming more acceptable to be homo, hetero, bi, transsexual? I really don't know anything about this, and that's why I'm asking. And I'm not just restricting this to, and it's the name of the person who initiated the response. Now, I can't put my hand in my heart and tell you that when this was going on, I was entirely comfortable with the conversation. And I know that my co-teacher, my local co-teacher at that time, we used to knock on each other's doors and said, have you seen the latest pose? We would analyse them, we would worry about them. I called in the participants, the two key participants, to my office and said, look, you do remember that you agreed at the beginning of this course that these posts could be made public, they could be used in research, they could be used in presentations. This is a Moodle site. The world, if it's interested, can be watching this interaction. It's not just confined to the classroom and to the learning community. Are you comfortable with that? And fortunately, the student said to me, no, we're actually very comfortable with that. We are actually enjoying this conversation. We are engaging with otherness as you wanted us to. And so back off and let us do it. So they were very mature, they were very adult, and the conversation did look at aspects of conflict between religious experience, sexual identity, religious conventions, the way that people were named, how communities excluded and included people on the basis of their religion as well as their sexuality. And it became a very, very rich telecollaborative experience. So that it showed to me that at its best, and it could have gone wrong, it could have ended in conflict and offence being taken. But because of the nature of the students, and the students, I think, had built up a level of trust where they could talk to each other at this level without taking offence and without blocking each other off. The classroom had become a safe space where we could revisit the posts, reflect upon them, and think about their consequences. It was also important, I think, that the teacher could have offline, face-to-face conversations with the individual learner saying, look, you know, I've been reading your posts, I can see there's an issue going on here, I support you, do you feel comfortable with what's going on? And then to give advice, support, scaffolding if the students are not feeling comfortable with the engagement with otherness. Because the engagement with otherness can be hard. It can undermine a sense of the self. So you want it to be an enriching experience, but that enriching experience has to be supported. And the students, the participants, need to know that they have your support. So what I hope that I've made clear about telecollaboration that aims to address otherness, diversity, and attempts to be inclusive within the learning community is that it takes a lot of work to set up in advance with a group of ironically like-minded people. It takes a lot of work during the telecollaboration to monitor what's going on, to make sure that students feel comfortable, to prompt them into different discursive roles, and to help them reflect upon what they're achieving. And it takes a lot of patience. One of the foremost authorities on online intercultural exchanges, Robert O'Dowd, has said that studies have shown repeatedly that learners need the guidance and informed insight of their teachers to create their own online correspondence and to interpret and respond to the messages, blog posts and video recordings that they receive from their partners. It's in the classroom analysis of these authentic foreign texts that cultural rich points emerge and the skills of the intercultural interaction and ethnographic interviewing can be honed. So what I hope I have shown in this lecture is that telecollaboration has at least the potential to be a powerful instrument for exploring diversity, engaging with otherness, and promoting inclusion. It doesn't do so necessarily directly. Those of you with ethnographic or social linguistic training might know this wonderful little book, Learning How to Ask by Charles Briggs, published in 1986, but still a classic. And one of the things that Briggs says is if you want to find out about attitudes and beliefs, if you want to explore people's views and perspectives on things, you don't ask them directly. You lead them indirectly through conversations. You ask leading questions. You listen to the responses. You listen attentively. You prompt rather than ask. You adopt a non-judgmental attitude, and then you analyse and reflect on the discourse that spontaneously emerges. And I think a lot of that happens in telecollaboration too. You begin with chat, you deepen the conversation, you explore the attitudes and the beliefs that come out, and then you reflect on that in a structured way. I believe I mentioned that we hoped to do this as a panel originally, but there were so many people that it became logistically difficult to figure out how to do it. I've had the privilege and the great honour to work with some fantastic collaborators. One of the nice things about telecollaboration is that you do meet and work with fantastic people. And I've worked in the past with Alison Phipps, Andrea Asante del Rio, Wendy Anderson, Peggy Liu, Ugo Dart, Bruno de Lima, Kristina Rubiek-Mazalska, Evie Gramanu, Nala Nasser, Beatrice Peña-Dix, and many others, not to mention the participants themselves who come and make these things really worthwhile. You now have time to grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or a non-alcoholic drink, or ask questions before the next session on the hour, which will be Alex Palanak talking about trauma-informed pedagogy in ELT for refugee students, a fascinating topic. Thank you very much indeed for listening.